Hello and welcome. My name's David, and today we're going to be discussing Aperture. What is it? What can it do? Why is it there? How do we use it as photographers? Okay, well, the first things first. Imagine your eye. Imagine the pupil in your eye. Now, Aperture works very much the same. So, if you're in light conditions, your pupil will go very small, and if you're in darker conditions, your eye will go, pupil in your eye will go very large, and that is basically what Aperture is. Now, with Aperture is the hole that's in the camera that opens and closes. It's generally known in f-stops. I'm sure you've seen it. It goes down. You get apertures like f1.8. You can get apertures of f22. If you see some cameras, so they've got a lowest aperture of say 4.6, 4.2, things like that. Okay, so with an aperture, the lower the number, the larger the hole, the more light that it feeds in. Because if you watch my last video on shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, they're all forms of ways of getting light into the camera. And aperture is the same as that. So if the hole is as large as it can be, then it's letting in more and more light. And that's called a shallow depth of field. So if it's shut as close as it can get, then that's obviously letting in a lot less light. So if it's open to, let's say 1.8, which means I've got a lens that's open. If I've got a lens that does 1.8, that means my lens is open really, really, really wide. So it's letting in more light. Now, the thing with that is a shallow depth of field. So let's say you're taking a portrait shot. It'll keep the person that you're taking in focus, and everything else in the background will be blurry. So it will only focus on that point. If you've got a higher aperture, f11, f12, high up like that, and even higher, then that brings more detail into the background. So if I'm taking a landscape shot, for example, I want all the detail to be nice and sharp. In that respect, I would use a high aperture. So it's kind of the opposite. High aperture, the smaller the hole. Low aperture, the larger the hole, and that's how it works. So if I'm taking a portrait shot and it's quite light outside, and I'm taking a shot outside, and I want a low aperture, I want the background to be nice and blurry, that means I need to do what? So if I've got a low aperture, I'm letting in lots and lots of light, so I need to combat that somehow. And the first place I'd go to would be my shutter speed. So for that, I would speed up the shutter speed, because that doesn't let so much light in, because then I'd want to go to my ISO last, because of course you want your ISO to be as low as it can be to stop the noise. So shallow depth of field, what does that actually mean? So if I've got, let's say, a wide angled lens on here, and I've got it down to 4.5 on my aperture to let loads and loads and loads of light in, and I've got that as wide as I can get it, the lens as wide as I can get it, it means my background's going to seem further away. It's going to make it look really big. If I've got a longer lens, so for example, if I've got a longer lens that goes up to say 300mm, and this is also a 4.5 aperture, and I do the same thing, I've got this as long as it can be, the focal length up to 300mm. It's going to bring the background and make the background look like it's closer to you. So basically, that is aperture in a nutshell. And other times when you would use, I mean, aperture, you use aperture all the time, basically. So, but if I'm shooting in low light at night time, it's early evening, it's quite low light, and I want to shoot, and I would try and get that aperture as open as much as I possibly can, and then I would combat that, or obviously use my shutter speed to help that. So smaller the f-stop number, say 1.8, the larger the hole. Bigger the f-stop number, f22, the smaller the hole. And the best way to remember it is remember how your pupil works. So if I go out during the day, my pupil's going to be really small because it's going to be quite bright conditions. And if I go out and in low lighting conditions, my pupil's going to be bigger. And when I'm using my aperture, that's basically what I think. I mean, what would my pupils be doing in this particular light? Unless, of course, I'm going for a certain effect. For example, I want to put some bokeh behind people, or I want a really blurry background, and then I would consider I want a really low aperture. A lot of the time, and a lot of people put their cameras on aperture priority mode. So if you're shooting something that's still like a portrait or something like that, you could put it on aperture priority mode, get the aperture down. The aperture would then decide what the shutter speed should be in that situation. If you're shooting something quite fast, for example, you want a lot of detail within the shot, you can bring your aperture up to say f9, f10, f11, f whatever you want, and again, the camera will change the shutter speed to the scene that you're trying to photograph. I hope that's been a help. That is aperture in a nutshell, really. Always just remember that it's the other way around. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole. The bigger the number, the smaller the hole. My name's David. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please like and share and subscribe to my channel. In the next lesson, we'll be going over ISO. The lesson after that, the tutorial after that, don't really like to call them lessons. The tutorial after that, we'll be looking at ISO. The tutorial after that, we'll be looking at bringing the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture all together to form the exposure triangle. Thank you very much for your time. My name's David.